Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the ISO, I'd like to welcome you to today's Resource Adequacy Modeling and Program Design Track 1 meeting to discuss the straw proposal for Track 1. My name is Christina Guimera, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs. Next slide, please. Just a reminder that today's call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. Please keep your comments professional and respectful today. Next slide, please. To ask questions during the meeting, you can open the participant and chat panels on the bottom right. You can then raise your hand by selecting the raise hand icon, or if you joined audio only, please press *3 on your device. And please do remember to state your name and affiliation first before making any comments. And you can also send in comments and questions via chat to all panelists or to myself directly. And if you run into any technical issues today, please contact Inteller Events, the host. Next slide, please. Today's agenda includes opening comments, followed by straw proposal discussion regarding updating CAISO's default RA rules and accounting for RA resource capabilities during peak conditions. And these discussions are going to be led by Ansel Lundberg, Partha Malvadkar, and Mark Kutstra, who are all in a conference room at the ISO. So after their discussion, we'll wrap up with next steps. So with that, I will turn things over to Partha to get us started. And Partha, you might be muted if you're speaking.
No, thank you, Christina. Appreciate that. And I had a good practice run, which I can try again. So, yeah, I really appreciate everybody's participation today. Just would note, in addition to Ansel and Mark here in the room, Abdul is joining us from our operations team, as well as David Zlotlo from legal and Kevin Head from the California Regulatory Affairs team. And yeah, I just was sort of maybe kick off with a few very brief opening remarks, just in terms of how we've gotten here in the process forward. Really appreciated the great stakeholder engagement so far in the starting out in the working group process, and sort of moving as we moved into the policy development and some of the proposals that we had, options that we had previewed from you previously, related to particularly for the Track 1 design. And I kind of note that part of the feedback we heard a lot of good specifics, which we consider as a part of this proposal. We also heard a desire to for us to put something out there to move along the conversation in terms of how we should evolve the various elements in the Track 1 design. And so I think we're continuing to seek people's feedback, and we kind of recognize the fact that there will be an opportunity for at least one more iteration based on the feedback. We also heard a desire from stakeholders to, hey, can we move this quickly? Can we drive this to resolution faster? And so we're seeking to sort of balance those two objectives as well as we move forward with the process. So with that, I think we'll get into some of the details in terms of what our straw proposal design looks like. Please jump in with questions. We'd love to hear your input, any questions you have around sort of the proposal. We recognize that for almost all these design elements, there really aren't necessarily easy answers, and there's various trade-offs between the different design choices, which were well reflected in people's comments. And that, yeah, look forward to the good discussion and driving this forward to completion. So with that, I'll turn it to Ansel to get into some of the meat in terms of our straw proposal.
Thank you, Bart. Well said. We have a high-level overview of what's in the straw proposal here on this slide. The proposal was released late last week, like Partha mentioned, developed with the stakeholder input that we've received through the working group process, and we look forward to kind of reviewing the details of the proposal today. We only have until 4 o'clock, but I want to make sure that we can have this time for stakeholder questions and feedback as much as possible. So we will review the material, and then we can talk about the next steps at the end of the meeting today. We'll be welcoming comments until the 25th and look forward to reviewing this and hearing folks' initial questions and feedback. So, as I mentioned, the proposal was released last week. The two major elements are the proposed revised default counting rules and planning reserve margin in CAISO's tariff, as well as proposed methodology for accounting for ambient D rates and resource capabilities in peak load conditions. So we will get more into these in future slides. Let's go to the next slide. So these are the objectives in the straw proposal listed for each element of the proposal. And what I'm going to do is go through review some of the stakeholder feedback that we received at a high level, and then we will go through the proposal itself. And then we can touch on some advantages and trade-offs that we highlight in the paper, and we can hear some discussion and questions. So with the updated default rules, these objectives were also outlined in the issue paper that we released at the end of last year, developed with stakeholders through the working group process. So for the default rules, we heard, the counting rules and the qualifying capacity methodology should be reflected in the tariff and reflect the relative contribution of different resource types, as well as individual resources to maintain a balancing authority-wide and local reliability, as well as the reserve margin methodology should be designed alongside these counting rules to create a coherent set of standards. And of course, if these standards were to be adopted across the BAA, the resulting capacity portfolio would be expected to meet a 1 in 10 loss of load expectation. And then on the right side, we have additional objectives for the portion related to accounting for resource capabilities, indicating that requirements should be adopted such that the ISO can rely on capacity to perform consistent with its RA value during peak load conditions. That is to say the resource's NQC value should reflect their expected ability to perform in peak load conditions. And these requirements should account for ambient D rates due to temperature impacts and thereby minimize that difference between the shown capacity and available capacity during those peak load conditions. So these are kind of the guiding objectives that we use to develop the straw proposal, and looking forward to hearing feedback on how the proposal meets these. So let's go to the next slide for a little bit on timeline. So this is a cross-section from the revised 2025 ISO policy initiatives roadmap that was issued a few weeks ago, and this was updated based on a stakeholder survey that was performed in spring, and we have made, I believe there were no changes made to the track 1 section. There were minimal changes made to the RA timelines across all tracks of the RA initiative. So we're still planning under these assumptions with a potential decision from the board by the end of the year. Okay, let's go to the next slide. I think those are that's our introductory material before we dive into the details of the proposal. I think we could take a moment if there are questions on some of those sort of process or high-level items that I had. We could answer questions if any.
We do have a hand raised from Paul Nelson.
Hi, this is Paul Nelson with the CPUC Energy Division. So you're looking to take this to your board in fourth quarter?
That is that's right. That's what you saw on the last slide under the policy roadmap.
And so for the tariff implementation date, what are you thinking, 2026 or 2027, mid-year?
I think it's always implementation after kind of a board decision on a policy matter is to be determined. So I think we don't have that information right now, but we have the plan for taking to the board for consideration, and then we can discuss implementation after we meet that milestone.
Yeah. And And Paul, love to hear your feedback more if there's any specific concerns you have with our timeline and plan. Obviously, I think right now we're really trying to make sure that the substance is right and that we're moving forward on changes that are substantially effective. And then, like, to some degree, but if there is sort of a specific concern you have, love to hear more about sort of any timing considerations that we should consider.
I was just curious on the timing considerations. And since this is a default, I don't know if there's a, unlike UCAP, where linkages between an effective date for CPUC, I'm not sure that there's a linkage, but yeah.
Yeah, there's only two portions within this track. That there were three, but through the default and the ambient discussions, like to some degree, like at least for the default, I mean, part of our consideration will be as well, like wanting to understand the timing and use particularly by LRAs who might be looking to have this information. So to the degree that there's sort of specific guidance that people could provide in terms of how this, how completing this initiative and having it come to resolution could be most useful or impactful for their programs or designs. Love to have that, love to hear that input. Yeah, no, thanks, Paul, for the question. That's super helpful.
And I'm not seeing any other questions coming in at this time.
All right. Thanks, Christina and Paul. I think at this time I can hand it to Mark for, or I'm sorry, we'll review the stakeholder feedback and then I'll hand it to Mark. So let's go to the next slide. So we got great feedback from stakeholders in our previous workshops where we discussed kind of the range of counting rule methodologies available and in use across North American energy markets. But we have retained the problem statements that you see here from the working group process. I'm not going to go through each of these, but these should look familiar. We developed through the stakeholder process, and these have been kind of our guiding statements that we've tried to address through this proposal based on feedback. So let's go to the next slide. So you may recall we did have an extensive discussion in February about sort of conceptual proposals and advantages and trade-offs that we got into in the issue paper at the end of the year last year. So we heard from local regulatory authority representatives that they continue to show support for the current approach with the default tariff RAQC methodology and planning reserve margin, which is the case that it only applies if a local regulatory authority does not provide their own QC methodology or PRM through the process, and they value that autonomy in setting their methodologies. From several non-Public Utilities Commission LRAs, we heard a preference for the default rules to reflect a single monthly value, which fits with the current showing process of the ISO, and there was support for continuing that existing program and providing default rules to fit that current program. From 6 cities and the Department of Water Resources, we did hear that there was openness to kind of revising the default rules. We've obviously been in the process of refining and reviewing our modeling methodology and inputs and assumptions for a while now with stakeholders. So we're glad to hear that this could be a useful process as LRAs move to revise their or revisit their programs. NCPA also showed support for Proposal 1. There's references to specific proposals, and there's a table in the paper that displays these proposals. But that one happened to be a mix of average effective load carrying capability and resource-specific unforced capacity methodologies. Let's go to the next slide. We heard from the Public Utilities Commission Energy Division support for Proposal 4, which aligns with their current slice of day resource adequacy program, and they raised a few concerns with proposals 1 through 3 based on various elements, and there was a suggestion for multiple qualifying capacity values for different risk hours if we move forward with Proposal 1. So we have been, we've engaged with stakeholders and the CPUC as the Slice of Day program has gone live and is now stood up in 2025. So we appreciate that collaboration. We heard from various suppliers and load-serving entities that they support a set of default rules that could achieve 1 in 10 loss of load expectation. I spoke to that in the objectives, and they showed support variously for proposals that could align with Slice of Day. And then generally we heard, you know, you may have noticed in the previous slides that there was no proposal in this paper for applying a unforced capacity D-rates through the net qualifying capacity process, which we did sort of put on the table in the February workshop and in the issue paper. But there was openness to UCAP as a default methodology. So that is what you'll see in the proposal right now. All right, let's go to the next slide. And now I can hand it to Mark, who will review the proposed methodologies.
Thank you, Ansel. So what we have on the screen right now is how we propose to establish the qualifying capacity for different groupings of resources. We are looking at 3 different approaches. So UCAP via supply cushion methodology for thermal, renewable thermal, excluding solar thermal and other resources not listed, and then also for pumped hydro. For supply side demand response, these are items or resources that are on the NQC list now and will show up as resources. We're looking at performance-based UCAP. And then for battery storage, hydro, including run-of-river, wind and solar, including the solar thermal, we're looking at an average ELCC. This is very similar to Proposal 1. And I'll talk a little bit about the difference in the next slide. But the PRM here is still expected to be measured against the peak load forecast. That would be a month-by-month value. Next slide, please. This next slide is looking at some additional information on basically the accreditation approach. What I would like to highlight is really the shift from Proposal 1 that we prepared and presented in February of batteries from a UCAP to an average ELCC approach. Why we're thinking about this, doing this is it's going to account for the interactive effects between the resources and energy storage, as well as handle the energy storage capacity limitations of the resource, rather than primarily focus on the power capacity limitations of the resource that was provided in UCAP. UCAP, again, it's going to be kind of a grab bag for all the resources that aren't in the ELCC, and that's, you know, all our gas plants, nuclear, biomass, geothermal, and pumped hydro as well. And these resources will have individual, so each unit would have its own resource-specific UCAP. And then demand response, as I mentioned before, is the performance-based accreditation method, focusing on the hours where the resource was called and how it performed. Next slide.
There are some questions.
Oh, we have some questions already. We can jump into that.
First in the queue, we have Eric Little.
Sorry, I got double muted there for a moment. So the question that I have on UCAP is twofold. First of all, we usually have thought of UCAP as being something that would replace RA-AIM because you get a lower qualifying capacity from the resource. Are you proposing that you would have a UCAP methodology and they would still be subject to RA-AIM, or are you suggesting to replace one or the other? And then the second question that I have is, since this is your default provisions, what would you do with a resource that you are using UCAP and some other LRA is not? How does that resource get accounted for when 2 different LSEs are depending upon that resource and the sum of the quantities exceed the UCAP?
I'll let Partha handle that first question. I think you wanted to take that.
Yeah, that sounds great. No, thanks for that first question. I do think that is an open question that we have within the design process. And what I'd recognize maybe first off is that the CPUC, and if I if I describe a little bit incorrectly, please correct me. They have this, UCAP is scoped as a part of their current track, RA reform track. So there's a high likelihood that at least for, 91% of the load within our footprint, that those resources from their program design UCAP would apply. So I think there's probably an open question of what is sort of the remaining problem statement, if anything, of entities from other entities that don't go to a UCAP design. I think that's sort of one of the feedback we're likely to want to get as we move into that RAIM reform discussion are enough of the LRAs kind of on board with the idea that they're doing a lot of the heavy lifting in the accreditation process that provides kind of a resource-specific incentive mechanism such that any sort of corresponding RAIM reforms can be designed with kind of an assumption that for the general case, there's been some sort of incentive mechanism being applied. So I think that's probably a policy topic that's going to basically be now kind of pushed, the consequences will be sort of pushed a little bit into that venue of figuring out how do we design a revised RAIM that works. But any feedback, Eric, or?
No, that's perfect. So what I'm understanding is this is envisioned to go along with the PUC contemplating UCAP, and assuming both of those go through, we don't have very much of a potential conflict. We may have some munis that decide not to go that direction. And I think that's fine. And that to some extent addresses the other question too, because you kind of minimize the possibility that you're going to have one resource sold to two different entities that use two different counting methodologies. So that's really helpful.
Yeah. I'm glad you got to the answer to the second question. I was gonna punt that to Abdul, but it sounds like anything else you'd like to elaborate? Or?
No, I think that's spot on. Hopefully we'll get the two changes aligned together well. Raymond / Murat coming up in the track 2, and in track 1 we're hoping to succeed with the UCAP approach. So I think that's exactly where we're planning to head, or hoping to head at least. And
if not, Abdul's a mathematician; he'll figure it out. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. And there's a second question that.
Yeah, I think you just answered the second.
Oh, I did. Okay. I answered the second. Okay.
Well, I think the second question, and Eric can jump back in, was really around the idea of what would happen if two different entities had different values.
Yeah, and I think to that one, Eric. So what we're proposing now are updating our default QC rules with UCAP. So our default rules, as you know, only get used if the LRAs do not adopt their own and establish their own QC. So these are more of, kind of backup advisory methodology. The PUC, as you know, always established and is establishing its own QC methodology. So at least we have that going. So there will always be QC numbers coming up from PUC. And as we said, looks like the PUC is moving to UCAP-based methodology. So we will get that. And that will be the reference for everyone. If another LRA comes up with a different methodology, then we will follow the same rules that we do today, which we would take both values from different LRAs and we use the higher value. So that, I think we didn't propose changes to that process here. We're simply proposing a new methodology for our default counting rules.
Okay, so just to be explicit and give an example of it to make sure I'm understanding this correctly, suppose you had a thermal resource whose current NQC is 100 megawatts, your UCAP says it's 80. You have an entity that's using that default says, I'm claiming 80, and you have a PUC entity saying, I'm claiming 20. That would pass all of the validations, is what I'm hearing?
If that, in your example of that entity that is using our default is an LRA, and it's establishing it as, adopting its own methodology and saying, yeah, based on that, the QC for that resource is 80, and then the PUC's methodology is 20, then we use the higher of the two, which is 80. But the key thing is it has to be LRA-driven, calculated numbers.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Next in the queue, I'm seeing a question from Perry Cervedia.
Hey, this is Perry Servideo, California Energy Storage Alliance. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
I'd like you to go back to slide 12 if you could. I have a few questions related to the comparability of these resources across resource types and technologies here. My first question is related to the supply cushion method. And I'm wondering, since you will be, or since you're proposing to have some resources accredited based on average ELCC and some based on UCAP with a supply cushion method, could you speak to how well the supply cushion hours align with the hours of reliability need in the LOLE study to establish the ELCC values?
Yeah, we actually have a slide on this in a little bit, so we can show where those supply cushion hours popped up in 2022 and 2023. And we don't currently have exactly where those concern hours are within the LOLE study used for the QC with all the different resources where those would pop up, but it's essentially the same as the summer assessment model of July, August, September in the net peak range. But we can address that a little bit more specifically in a few slides.
Yeah, I guess the question will be just how well they actually align, not there are more hours that don't align specifically with the hours that are basically setting the average ELCC values. That's really going to be the question. But if you have a slide on that, I can wait for that time to pick back up on that thread. The other question I had was whether or not the study you're using to set average ELCCs includes a outage maintenance rate in it.
And again, we'll touch on that in a little bit, but we are focused on forced outages for that. No,
so you're not, okay, so you're not going to model in planned outage maintenance rates into the study used to establish the average ELCC values. Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
Okay. It's my understanding, though, that the supply cushion hour approach, I shouldn't say explicitly, but implicitly relies on, implicitly is determined based on outages that are on maintenance, because they would not be shown or available as RA in certain hours, which then would tighten the supply cushion. Have you guys reconciled that between the two?
We can talk about it.
Yeah, we'll talk about that, the specific supply cushion hours and how that we came up with that in a few slides as well.
Okay, yeah, so as you go through that, it would be helpful to get this additional color, because we're very focused on the comparability across these resource types and seeing different methodologies used for different resource types. I think at a minimum would enable divergence in these and make them not be comparable unless it's carefully attended to. So thanks.
Thank you.
Next in the queue, I'm seeing a hand raised from Lisa Bro.
Hi, thank you, Lisa Bro with Microsoft. Just a quick high-level question as I'm thinking about these default counting rules. And we talked a little bit about timeline. I'm guessing the earliest these might be implemented is 2027 or a year. Do you guys have any sort of gut take, especially thinking about coordinating with the CPUC on the UCAP methods? Is it 2027, maybe 2028? I know this is high level, but just sort of trying to gauge when we might see some of these things in our RA world.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. This is Ansel. I think in the paper we have a short section about kind of the use of the default QC methodology going forward. And we do want to hear from local regulatory authority representatives about kind of how they could see themselves making use of these methodologies, if that means providing kind of reference values through a default QC list. I think we can consider this. We have momentum clearly on sort of the study process with updating the summer assessment model and sort of providing these methodologies, but we don't have kind of a timeline specifically for providing values. I think it's, I don't see us providing values at all this summer for the 2026 RA year, but beyond that, we're open to discussion. So.
Okay, thank you.
Next, I'm just seeing a question in the chat from Peter Griffs asking to hear more about the logic of treating battery storage differently from pump storage.
Yeah, and this is something we welcome feedback on. If folks think that there's a better way to do this, we'd love to hear what that would be. The main logic behind that is the duration with which they can each discharge. So pump storage is able to discharge for a lot longer, and the energy limitations is generally less of a concern compared to battery storage. So that's the base logic at this point in time.
Thank you. And I'm not seeing any other questions at this time.
Thank you very much, Christina. So taking those different methodologies, the way we're looking at the PRM is going to be a natural outflow of what qualifying capacity is needed in the monthly portfolio to reach the annual 0.1 loss of load expectation. So it's really going to be the PRM is a result of what it takes to get to that annual 0.1 LOLE divided by each month's peak. And that peak is the highest managed hourly forecast in the CECs 1 and 2 CED. And then, again, we're going to look at monthly PRMs and QC values. So those will all get added up and work together. You can go to the next slide. And the way we're looking to do this...
Penny's hand, old one?
Yeah.
No.
The way we're looking to do this calibration is to actually take the same event or unserved energy event distribution that we found in the summer assessment model. In that case, that was 50 outage events across all 500 samples. And you apply that to each month and calibrate to that specific outage number on a monthly basis. So that'll get us to that 0.1 LOLE. This will help us or allow us to account for actual system risks that we're seeing from our summer assessment model that can change over time. You know, if we start to see more and more reliability events earlier in the year, say January, February, March, associated with winter peaking systems, that will naturally flow into this calibration process. And so this is currently what we're looking at for that calibration as opposed to applying a uniform loss of load expectation across all months. Can we go to the next slide?
Mark, if I may.
Yep.
On the previous slide, I just wanted to kind of highlight, you know, what this means is essentially a default monthly PRM that may vary across each month. But I think it's a nice way of allowing a portfolio that represents a 1 in 10 loss of load expectation capability across the whole year to sort of be reflected in procurement targets across the same year. And what that looks like is potentially a different PRM for each month, depending on the study. I think just highlighting that approach.
Thank you, Ansel.
Yeah.
It looks like we have a hand up from Eric Little if we want to answer that, Christina.
Yeah, just a quick question. I guess first a statement. It would be nice to see this calibrated with the PUC to make sure that there is a similar basis. But secondly, a question for you. I'm assuming that you're not proposing to change any of the provisions that the ISO has about backstop procurement for deficiencies, either individual or cumulative. And what I'm basically asking is, if you determine that the LOLE is much higher than other LRAs, I am assuming that your cumulative deficiency will still use the other LRA's PRM. Is that correct? Or does this risk the potential that if the ISO has a much higher LOLE, that they will be outdoing backstop?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. This is Partha. I'm happy to take that. So maybe I'll note first that we do have a mixed phase of our track 3 RA reforms related to our backstop processes. The easy answer to your question is currently no. There'd be no sort of tie into the default rules and our assessments to be sort of used directly in making decisions around our backstop procurement processes. That being said, I think we recognize the fact that there will be a lot of different perspectives about how our backstop reforms, need to occur. Whether or not there needs to be sort of different ways in which we're conducting them, different needs assessments. So I think that there's a lot of different options that will be on the table at that time. But for the sake of the easy answer for this one is that we fully recognize the fact that that will need to be those are complex issues, and we're certainly wanting to make sure that we are staying aligned with the LRAs and working collaboratively with them. And the goal of this is not to work on something that's contradictory to their program designs in terms of moving forward. So, yeah.
Okay.
Any follow-up, Eric? Or?
No, thank you. I appreciate the answer.
Yep.
Looks like we've got another question from Steve Keene.
Yeah, the second bullet there that allows for monthly QC and PRM values. I just want to make clear, does that mean the PRM values will change by month?
That is our expectation, is that we'll have month-specific PRM and QC values. Correct.
Then the next question I ask, based on the picture you have there, in the 9 months where there is no unserved energy event, how are you going to set a PRM?
I am going to talk about that on the next slide and go for that one.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. All right. So Steve's question leads very well into the next slide. Yeah, we'll go to the next slide. So how does this, actually might be another slide down the road. If we can go to the next one. I do want to talk about the planned outages first, and I'll talk about the calibration for the months where we have no unserved energy events. So for planned outages, which Perry brought up a little bit ago, we are removing the planned outages from the model for the QC calculation. And the reason for this is planned outages in our RA program require substitution. And so we would want to make sure that our QC values and PRMs don't incorporate inherently those planned outages. And we effectively require planned outages to be covered, and we require substitution at the same time. As a result, the portfolio will become more reliable because there's more capacity available at that time. So we have to be able to address that. And the way we're proposing to reduce that reliability back down to the targeted number of events by month is to remove gas capacity, which would be a proxy for how much RA eligible capacity can be on planned outage while still showing sufficient capacity to meet the reliability targets. So basically, we're looking at all the 500 samples that we have of outages within each month. We're removing those planned outages, and then we're basically feeding some of that capacity back in as plants that are just fully turned off for a specific month. And a couple of reasons why we like this approach. The first is removing those planned outages and then adding the planned outages. Sorry, I'm saying these backwards. Removing the planned outages is increasing that reliability, and then we're using the gas to reduce it back down to the right target. Because we're crediting gas with UCAP, we know exactly how much qualifying capacity got removed. We can clearly say in our PRM calculation that this qualifying capacity is not present when setting that PRM calculation. So that makes things pretty simpler and more straightforward on the PRM calculation side. And then this is also looking at removing gas capacity, which allows us to understand the reliability of the system with fewer shown gas resources and more reliance on duration limited and variable energy resources. So this is still theoretically a showing that would meet all the reliability criteria. We're still going to get to the necessary loss of load expectation, but we're going to do it by removing those gas plants in their entirety across the whole month. And I believe that's the next slide. We'll talk a little bit about how that will work specifically, but that's what we're looking at. The added benefit is also it gives us that information on how much of the eligible capacity for RA can be on planned outages in any particular month. So we have some information from that as well. Can we go to the next slide? So how are we going to remove those gas plants? And what we're proposing to do is to start with the smallest gas plants and remove the smallest gas plants in a largely equal distribution, or as best we can, between the PG&E areas in our model and SCE, SDG&E, so the north and southern part of the systems. And so we'll remove gas capacity. For the pictures you have here, will be a month that has 15 events in the initial model from the summer assessment. What we would then do is remove gas capacity, starting with those smallest plants going up. So we'd remove gas plants 1 through 4. But in that case, we'd end up with 17 events, so that's too much gas capacity being removed. So we'd go back down and only remove gas plants 1 through 3. In this case, that may mean that we have too reliable of a month at that point with 14 events. In that case, what we would then look at doing is taking plant 4 back out, but then starting to add plant 1 in again as well, so that we pull out plants 2 through 4. So using the smallest plants to be removed first, going larger, and then if we need to, we can add back in those smaller plants to get us the right number of events. For months such as January that have no events, what we're looking to do is to do this calibration approach to get the number of events to 1, and then add additional gas capacity back in until we get rid of that last event. So we're still going to be calibrating to 0, but it's essentially the smallest amount of gas present on that system that allows us to still get to 0 events in that month. I can pause for questions. Steve, you've had the specific question, so if you wanted to jump in or need more clarification.
I'm not seeing any. Oh, we just got a hand raised from Perry Cervedia.
All right, go ahead.
This is Perry Cervedio, CISA. So just to clarify, this slide is focused on the part of the process where you're establishing the ELCC value. Is that right?
It's not actually the ELCC value yet. This is recalibrating the system to, or the base system to a 0.1 LOLE. So because we removed the planned outages out of the model, we now have to recalibrate to the 0.1 LOLE. When we go to actually solving for the ELCC values, we will take a slightly different approach for the calibration.
Okay, so then I think my question might be on the previous slide. I want to just understand what you mean by removing the planned outages. And maybe you could just correct my understanding. I'm thinking about, you know, the LOLE study itself, and you know, the software used to determine those unserved energy time periods and events. And I guess my question is will that run include a maintenance rate on any of the resources in the model? I understand that there's a parameter to set for maintenance rate, forced outages, et cetera. Will it include a maintenance rate, or will it just say the maintenance rate is 0?
It'll essentially be that the maintenance rate is 0. It will be it's not a term we define in the model. Okay,
so if the maintenance rate will be 0, then can you walk me through what you're doing in this step by what are you removing? This is the step where then you're stacking up the resources. What do you mean by removing planned outages at this point?
By removing planned outages at this point, we are decreasing the amount that plants are taken out for maintenance for planned outages. So it's only going to be forced outages that remove a plant from service in our model. And then what we're doing here is then just taking gas plants out of the model entirely for individual months to recalibrate back down to the selected number of events.
So it's sort of a sequence element, right? The first, there's a step of removing the planned outages to align with substitution requirements. And then what happens after that is the calibration process to match monthly event distribution.
The process step, because you're starting with summer assessment module as the starting point, which already has the planned outages module. You'll have to remove the planned outages. But if you were building a model from scratch, then it would not have any planned outages.
Okay, so I think I heard you say this before too, that you plan to use the summer assessment model. Does that model include the planned maintenance rate within it
Yep,
as a parameter, and it's set to a non-zero value?
Correct.
yep.
Okay, that was my question then. The actual
Yeah, it has to be,
yeah,
go ahead, Gary, sorry.
the actual model, it will be using a non-zero maintenance rate. And then this step occurs after that model where you're now going to add back in planned outages in some way. Am I getting that right? Or because this is saying remove.
Yeah, I'm going to step you back. So we're starting from that summer assessment model, which includes planned outage rates for all these plants. And what we're saying is we're going to eliminate those planned outages so that they don't exist in the model we're using for this process. So that's what I mean by removing it. We're rerunning the model, correct.
Oh,
and so because we're running that exact same model minus the planned outages, we're going to be more reliable than the 0.1 LOLE, which is then forcing us to recalibrate it, and we're choosing to recalibrate it by removing gas capacity, which does give us some information on how many resources could be on planned outages at those times, but we're not factoring that into the QC PRM calculation. We're just saying we need to remove this amount of gas to get back to that event target for this month.
Okay, so I'm going to use that framing. It's a model. You're using the model for the summer assessment. You're going to say, great, we already have the model. Now we need to make it work for this purpose. So we're going to set all the maintenance rates to 0 in that model and rerun that model.
Correct.
Okay, so that's the part about, okay, so now you've confirmed we're not modeling planned maintenance in that model. And then you have the additional step now to remove the thermals. Can you explain that part?
We're removing the gas plants. Is that what you wanted to explain?
Yeah.
Yeah, so when we run that summer assessment model with only forced outages included, so the maintenance outage is set to 0, our reliability is going to be higher than the 0.1 LOLE. So in order to get back to the 0.1 LOLE, we're just removing gas plants for the entire month from that. And so those gas plants are not just removed from the model, but they're also removed from the PRM calculation that we'll do later.
Okay, I think I understand that part. I did have a question, though. You'll still have the forced outage rate modeled? Will it be the same forced outage rate from the summer assessment?
Yes.
Okay, and then so those two models will stay aligned on forced outage rate, and will that be the same forced outage rate that is used in the UCAP value that's used to set the UCAP for, say, a natural gas plant?
It will be sourced from the same set of data, but because we're using a supply cushion for the UCAP, it will not be the exact same numbers. Because the forced outages used in our model look at the forced outage rate for the plant over the whole period of time.
Okay, so then is there any concern there that using different forced outage rates in this model to set one resource's ELCC value than the rate used to set another resource's, say, QC value? Do you have any concerns that there's a possibility that those are not necessary, in the end product, not necessarily comparable QC values?
That's something I will continue.
I don't believe that.
I don't believe that.
Yeah, I don't believe that issue exists because the same outage rates that are calculated using the outage cards in OMS is modeled in both places, right? So that doesn't exist. But what happens is if you were doing an E4 kind of UCAP-D rate, then it would be the exact same value. But since our UCAP methodology is supply cushion based, it'll be a different method, but I don't think it's different outage rates.
Will it be more? Well, Yeah, so I have two concerns there. It seems more aligned to just use the same, say, E4D rate in both this study to set one resource's ELCC values that you're going to use to set another resource's UCAP values. And then at least it's the same underlying forced outage rate value. It just at its face, it seems that way. The other thing, and I was getting to this earlier, is that the determination of the supply cushion hours themselves is dependent on which resources happen to be taking maintenance outages at certain times during the year in the historical data set. So it's implied the hours selected for what's in demand under a supply cushion approach, it's implied that it's based on, in part on whatever the maintenance that resources happen to have been taking, which is another area where I'd be worried that these two things get maligned.
I don't want to get into the supply cushion discussion right now, Perry, but I think your concern is alleviated by the approach that Mark will talk. We can talk more about it at that point. But I think the same outage rates are flowing through the model. So you have three kinds of outage rates, right? Planned, forced, and temperature derate. Temperature derate will stay, forced will stay, only the planned will become zero in this calibration step.
Do you guys, may I suggest that because we haven't talked about supply cushion methodology, LCC, so maybe we go through all of these slides, Perry, and then at the end, if you still have a question, if you want to come back, maybe that would be easier.
Yeah, I mean, it's been helpful to talk this through also at this point. So yeah, if you want me to wait to hear more about supply cushion, then I'm fine to wait.
Thanks, Perry. Steve, I think you're up next.
Hey, Steve Keen from Edison. Looking at the process that you've outlined here, have you done samples on this? Because I'd be really interested what the numbers are across the different months, because I could see them, the PRM in those months varying incredibly wildly.
We haven't flown the process through all the way to the end at this point, so I can't comment on what those PRMs will be at this point. But yeah, there's a possibility it will vary significantly, largely with how load varies across the year and the certainty surrounding load. Those will be big components of it, and I think that's the reality of the system.
And also, it's not just the PRM moving up and down, it's the counting rules also go. So the same resource is worth differently in January than it is in July.
Correct. In
this default method of counting. So in combination, it's not asking for a different portfolio as you go from month to month. Mm-hmm. It's about what subset of resources are available that meet your requirement.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, yeah, so make sure I understand this. The QCs are going to change on a monthly basis too.
Yes.
And you're going to, so like when entities have to do their, the annual filing, even if they show the same portfolio for the 5 summer months, they're going to potentially have to meet a different PRM in each of those 5 different months, but also even with the exact same resources, that the value of those resources will vary across the 5 months.
Yeah, that's in the technical application of this, but practically we can look at the numbers, and then if there is desire, if they're all within a small percentage, we can just say, hey, let's use one single PRM number as the default. We can come up with, based on looking at the data, we can refine, we can do seasons and stuff, but for right now, we want to calculate one for each month.
You'd also, instead of just looking at the PRM, you'd also have to look at the QC values, right?
Exactly, yeah.
The PRMs might be the same, but if the QC values are changing tremendously, then
Yeah.
you'd still have to have individual months. All right.
Mm-hmm.
I have to think about the implications of this. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we can jump ahead to slide 18. At this point, we've talked about 17 already. Okay, so once we have our system recalibrated back to the targeted number of events in each month, we will then start looking at what the equivalent PCAP value of the resources that we're going to be applying the ELCCs for. So in this example we have here, and this is very similar to other approaches, but we're looking at the specific number of unserved energy events rather than using the LOLE number. It's essentially the same thing, it's just looking at a different unit, essentially. So if we had 10 outage events in a specific month, we'd start at 0.1 here on the graph. We've got those 10 outages. What we would then do to get to 0.2 is we'd be increasing the number of events by removing a specific resource type. And so in this case, that would jump up to 15 events from 10. And then we would be adding perfect capacity into the system and increasing amounts until we get the number of events back down to 10 at 0.3. So the total amount of PCAP that's added for this, in this case, I think that's about 500 megawatts. That would be the total PCAP value of the resources that were removed from the model. And then we repeat this for the next resource. So in this case, we'd be doing that for wind, solar, batteries, and hydro. And then we would also run that same test for all 4 of those resources out at the same time. If we can go to the next slide, I can explain that one as well. And so the reason why we're running that for all 4 of those resources out at once is that we want to understand what interactive effects are getting picked up, because if you remove solar, the amount of perfect capacity you need to replace solar may not actually be equal to the value that that solar provides on its own, but the value that solar provides because the wind and batteries and hydro exist as well. And so we want to calibrate the individual resource PCAP values. So the individual PCAP that was required to replace solar, we want to calibrate that down so that the sum of the individual resource PCAP, the PCAPs for each resource, adds up to the total PCAP for all those resources at once. This means that if each resource, say, is 100 megawatts of PCAP equivalent, but the total PCAP value for all of them at once was 300 megawatts, we'd be scaling down the PCAP that each resource had by 1/3, so that we, or that would be 1/4, sorry, so that we would get to the QC value. So we solve for this alpha factor here, which is a scaling factor. If the resources individually add up to more than what they were as one, we'd be scaling down. If the opposite is true, where you move solar, wind, OESR, and hydro all at once, is a lower value than individual. Sorry, it's the opposite. All the resources at once is a higher value than the individual, we'd be scaling them up. So to calculate the ELCC values for solar, we take that perfect capacity that we found through the model, we divide it by the installed capacity and divide it by the alpha factor that we have above to scale that down, and then the QC for individual resources would be that resource's installed capacity times the ELCC value. Go to the next slide, please.
Mary Neal has maybe it's a qualifying question.
Yeah, we can go to that question.
The hand raised from Mary Neal.
Yeah, on the ELCC question, I was just wondering if, like, for instance, on that slide, you have like ELCC solar. Would it be for all solar? Would it be for different regions of solar, different regions of wind? And then like for batteries, would you have separate ELCCs based on duration? I know we have lots of 4-hour duration right now, but there'll be 8-hour duration at some point, et cetera. And then also, like, what about battery technologies? I know we have a lot of lithium, but if we have flow batteries or iron air coming online, because I know we talk about like one ELCC per resource type, but I just wonder, how realistic is that, or are we actually really going to have a lot of different values here? Or is it just going to depend on what's going on with the system? Or, but let us know. What are you thinking?
Yeah, right now we're expecting to have one ELCC value for all solar, one ELCC value for all battery energy storage, one ELCC value for all wind, one ELCC value for all hydro. We're very much open to folks suggesting other breakdowns, but we also want to be mindful of the more granular you get, the more model runs you have to do and balancing usefulness with these numbers as well.
Okay, well that's clarification.
Thanks, Mary. But if there is ever a need for any purpose that we have to go and assign the total ELCC for a resource type to individual resources, we can figure it out based on performance or availability. There are criteria that you can define to give a portion of that, share the pie kind of thing.
Yeah. Thank you, Mary. So now we're going to look at the supply cushion UCAP approach. And we are looking at essentially the availability of resources during the hours with the least supply cushion. And that's going to be determined for peak and non-peak seasons, and 28% tightest RA supply cushion hours in each season. So that's the 20% tightest hours in the peak and the 20% tightest in the non-peak hours. And so if we're looking at a May to October peak season, that would approximately be an equal number of hours in each season. Months have different number of days. That's the reason why they're different at this point, but it'd be 20% in both cases. We're looking at making use of the past 3 years of operations data, so the past 3 years that we actually have present when we do the calculation, with a heavier weighting towards the most recent years. And the outages are going to be sourced from the OMS, and we're going to focus on outages that are not outside management control. Nope, I'm saying that one wrong. Outages from OMS, and do not consider outages outside of management control. So we are including ambient derates and general forced outage situations that we have. I'm looking on the right for that equation. What we're focusing in on is how many of the megawatts of that unit is out in every particular instance. Divide that by the capacity of the resource, and then again divide and add those all together, divided by the supply cushion hours, and that gets the amount you have to subtract from 1 to basically get your UCAP factor, which is multiplied by the Pmax of the resource. For the weighted average, the weighted average UCAP from each year, we're looking at 45% for the previous year, 35% for the year before that, and 20% for the first year in that range. So that's the breakdown that we're looking at this point. You can go to the next slide. So the specific supply cushion hours we're looking at are the top 20% of hours with the lowest calculated supply cushion, and that's on a megawatt hour basis. Or sorry, not a megawatt basis. So supply cushion is the daily shown RA, excluding wind and solar, minus the planned outages, the opportunity outages, the urgent outages, and forced outages, as well, and then subtracting the net load, which is also net of wind and solar, so those should work out well. So we're accounting for the wind and solar there, and then also subtracting out the contingency reserves, making the regulation up, spin, and non-spin resources. So it's the leftover megawatts. In some cases, this is going to be a negative cushion. In other cases, it'll be a positive cushion. And acknowledging that we have 5-minute data, we are rolling that 5-minute data up by averaging it to get us to a full hour worth of interval information. I'm going to go to the next slide. I think, should we take questions or finish this out, you think?
Yeah. Go to 24,
yeah.
And then, yeah.
So let's go to the next slide. This gets to, I believe, Perry, your question about the hours where we're seeing those supply cushions happening. This is for 2022 and 2023. So this is the 20% of the tightest supply cushion hours. For the breakdown here, it is May to October is considered the peak. So there is approximately equal number of hours between May and October, and then the rest of the year. So you do see quite a bit of buildup of hours in the net peak hours. You do see a fair amount of supply cushion hours outside of that as well, but it is focused in the net peak hours for the most part. It does change from month to month. And I believe, I can't remember the exact hours from the summer assessment, but I believe it was July, August, and September, and it was about hours 19, 20, and 21 where we saw most of the averages. So those are some relatively high supply cushion days as well. We can go to the next slide. So that's our previous slides was our supply cushion UCAP. Now we're looking at performance-based UCAP accreditation, and this is going to be for the supply side demand response resources that are on the NQC list. For these resources, we're just looking at what their performance is when they've received dispatch instructions, either through market awards or tests. So if they were told to turn on, how much did they actually provide compared to how much they were asked to provide. So we'll track the historic performance over the prior 3 years and compare those dispatches to what they actually did. And we do propose to apply this at a DR provider level rather than an individual resource. This is intended to discourage changing or creating new resource IDs to reset the calculation or go with an average. It also allows us to have a little bit more of a possibility for history, to have those 3 years get hit more, since these resource IDs do change more often than other resources. Next slide. And this is getting back to the PRM calculation that we have here. So making use of the qualifying capacity that we have here, where we have the resource mix from the model that's used to find the ELCC values, but then we're adding up the UCAP for the resources that are in the model, the QC for the resources that are in the model, and the QC for the DR resources that were in the model. So we're only counting the qualifying capacity from the resources that were in the model for each month, and we're injecting in what those QC values are, dividing that by the peak for that month, and subtracting from 1 and multiplying by 100% to get us what that PRM is going to be. And for clarity's sake, yes, we are expecting to have different PRMs from month to month, and we are expecting to have different QC values from month to month. With UCAP, we are expecting those to be uniform across an entire season. For ELCCs, those would be different from month to month, and DR would likely be for that year as well. So that's what we're looking at for the PRM. I think we have a list of questions, and I think we can get to those as well at this point.
Yeah, so first in the queue, we have Lisa Bro.
Hi, thanks. This is slightly back to the last discussion, Lisa Bro, Microsoft. You say you start with the base system with 10 events in a month. How do you define an event?
Yeah, so we define an event similar to, or the same as we have in the summer assessment model. So that is a situation where the supply that we have in the model is insufficient to meet all the load, and then our specific required reserves, which is our regulation up, our spin reserves, our non-spin reserves, and our frequency response or HEP. So there's a fair amount of reserves that it needs to meet in addition to the load. So if any of those go unmet, which is essentially us going into an EEA type of event or a watch, that's when we flag it as an unserved event.
Okay, thank you.
Next in the queue, we have Perry Cervedio.
Hey, this is Perry from CISA again. Could you go back to the supply cushion hours slide?
Yeah, let's do slide 22.
That's 22, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, this one. Thank you. So I think this is probably the best slide to just illustrate the concern that we have. And I think that it would be helpful, you know, I can look at this and I could say it's pretty clear to me that So in the top 20% hours, whichever on here, those will be probably these hours that are colored in, right? That are not dark green. It's pretty clear to me that these are not going to be the same hours of day and month that you saw expected unserved energy events in the LOLE model. Am I right in that assumption?
I mean, they do not have a perfect alignment, but there is a fair amount of similarities. But they're not perfectly aligned, and they can't be.
Right. So you'd assess for one resource type its forced outage rate in this set of hours, and then say subtract that from the resource Pmax to set its QC value in general under the UCAP approach. And what that resulting number is that resource's expected contribution towards reliability in these hours that you've selected here. Whereas to the extent that it is a different or less hours or a different set of hours in any way under the ELCC approach for the expected unserved hours, if those are different, then the resulting QC value under the ELCC approach are those resources contribution to reliability specific to those hours of needs. So you have two resources that have a QC value based on different hours of need, which tells me that the two are not comparable values under a holistic RA program. Am I interpreting that wrong, or am I missing something that doesn't make it as extreme? Or
I don't think it's as extreme as I'm hearing from you at this point, because we are doing an average ELCC, not a direct loss of load. We're not looking at only the hours where loss of load happened. We're looking with the ELCCs at what that overall contribution is from a probabilistic standpoint of those resources, which you are correct is inherently different from the UCAP. Not to say that they're incompatible, just they're going to be a little bit different. I think some of it, sorry.
I was just going to ask a follow-up to Perry. Did you have anything else?
I was going to add, there is also looking at how we develop the PRM out of this. Yes, we are aware that, you want the ELCC values to be comparable for the ability to substitute properly and interchangeable. But I think with using the same set of resources in the model and in the LOLE model that we're using and in the PRM calculation, unless these numbers are significantly different, that should still get us to a reasonable PRM value with these resources and the interchangeability. Should be reasonable, but I'm very open to hearing more of your thoughts on this, and if there's things we should do to address this.
Yeah, we are concerned that to the extent that these particular hours do not align with the hours under which other resources will be assessed for their contribution to reliability, you're going to have two values that are not comparable. Now, you can do other stuff in the study with the PRM and all of that, but I think at its core, you'd want them to be comparable so that when people are making procurement decisions, they're making the right trade-off between the resource types. So I would ask if you guys had considered just using the EUE hours or the same hours under which your ELCC resources will be assessed to assess the UCAP forced outage rate under. That would be one way to potentially align the two.
So Perry, the only resource type that is looking at performance-based is demand response in critical hours, or whenever it was called, right? Subset of hours. But average ELCC looks at the resource performance 8760. So it's not a subset of hours. So that, meaning it is not looking at the performance of the resources. It's not like the DLOL or marginal ELCC kind of contribution, right? Average is looking at the fleet performance for the entire year. But what this is calculating is the RA supply cushion hours. I think that is what hours you choose is the RA supply cushion based our identification, but we'll calculate UCAP for all resources. So in many cases, in the hours, let's say 1 to 10 in a couple of years, you might not see any events pop up, any UCAP related adjustment pop up. It might just be in the evening hours, right? If you look at the numbers based on how the calculation turns out to be, because there are other resources or resources were available. So we can show more of how that data looks, but I don't think it is swaying from or spreading it through thin, if that's what you're trying to suggest.
Yeah, I think just at a high level, the suggestion is that this, whatever resource type uses these hours, it's a forced outage rate based on these sort of assessment hours, if you will, which is going to say, basically tell you how that resource's contribution to reliability in the hours you chose. And I think it's a different set of hours that are actually the hours where CAISO really needs the capacity, which is then going to be the bar for the resources that you've put under the ELCC approach. And I think a big driver of the difference in the hours gets to how you've defined the supply cushion hours. So I was just suggesting, consider aligning the 2 hours just at its face. That might be one way to get a comparable value out of this. Consider it. That might have pros and cons or complications, but I would consider that. The other question that is buried kind of in here is on the prior slide. I guess it would be page 21.
No, before you go to the next question, Perry, I have a thought here.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Would it be helpful if we said, if we define the set of hours as 18 to 23, for example, and then determine the UCAP based on those hours?
Yeah, if you never see an expected unserved energy hour, an hour ending 3, that under this approach, you're trying to determine a resource's forced outage rate based on whether it had forced outage an hour ending 3, and it's like that's not even aligned with when the hours are that we really need the thing based on the LOLE study. So if the EUE hours are always 18 through 23, it would seem that you could go here and just assess the UCAP in 18 through 23. You can make that specific to months and changing values per month, but I'm looking just for some way to get the two aligned, and I can do one step back question from that. I'm trying to work within the construct you put here, which is you have one resource set type under UCAP and a different set of resources under ELCC.
I think Pierre is trying to say use the same hours basically that you're using for average LCC, use those also for UCAP instead of supply cushion hours.
Mm-hmm.
So whatever hours we come up with as potential hours of expected unserved energy, those hours, use those to kind of take the forced outages for the UCAP fleet and apply the forced outage that they have, the forced outage rate for these hours. So just, I guess, be consistent about it. And I don't know, I think that's something we have to think about is will we get enough hours, EUE hours, that would make the supply cushion or the UCAP application effective in covering a reasonable number of hours while remaining, I think that's what UCAP is attempting to do. 20% UCAP is attempting to focus on where the need is the most, and that's why we're seeing the heat is mostly in the afternoon, evening peak hours, but there's still hours in the rest of the day also showing up that would give us the focus on the evening hours while also having some coverage in the rest of the day hours, and that would incentivize availability and performance of the fleet while being, crediting the fleet as the most when based on their performance in the evening hours. So would we get a similar, I guess, fair, I don't know if we thought about it, but Perry, maybe that's also for you, is would we get a similar result if we align the EUE hours and use them for a UCAP calculation?
I was not recommending just using EUE hours. Sorry, Perry. I was just not suggesting that we should look at EUE hours only because they are small subset, and if that resource was not available during that 1 hour, it would get a higher UCAP D rate. So that probably is, then you will have the opposite problem. So maybe we should just focus and say, when we do this methodology, we can see what is the impact for the UCAP D rating from non-16 to 22 hours. Like what's the other hours impacting the UCAP, and then we can have a discussion and figure out what methodology is better.
Yeah, so you're kind of getting to my next point, which is if you go to the prior slide, you know, there's lots of reasons why this chart looks the way it does. And the supply cushion hours approach, just as defined, is not really telling you when these resources are actually in demand. Look, it's taking planned outages out of the cushion, which is determined before this fleet even gets to CAISO. So it'll be dependent on what people are decide to do with their outages in a given month. And this is based on the RA that's shown, which is, you know, I thought we're trying to figure out a resource's contribution or reliability. It's not apparent to me that that should be based on the resources that happen to have been shown in that month in the past. I think a broader or a more holistic approach would be to define an E4D calculation where you determine how you're going to figure out when resources are actually in demand, and you apply that calculation in both your, you come up with the rate to feed into the LOLE study, and you use those same hours in the UCAP. Or the other question was, why are we not just having all of the resources either under ELCC or all of the resources under UCAP? Then we don't have really any of this sort of comparability problem. I was going to save that question, but like, you know, that is another question of, okay, I'm only driving into this because there are different approaches to different resource types. And to the extent that they're different, we want to make sure that results are comparable.
Yeah, I guess we can look at that. Sorry, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Next in the queue, we have a hand raised from Paul Nelson.
Hi, this is Paul Nelson from the CPUC Energy Division. And I just wanted to kind of alert the CAISO, I mean, the CPUC's, you know, engagement in developing UCAP and trying to get consistency. And I think going back to my prior comment about scheduling, I think they'll have to see something to be looked at here. You know, this is one of the reasons why the discussion we just had on the supply cushion is this is one of the reasons why we weren't comfortable yet putting in something in the you know, proposed decision that's under review. And then I wanted to alert, I think it was a slide prior, it was the weighting. You know, the staff's original proposal was a similar weighting, but the comments we received, we didn't get a lot of overwhelming support for that comment. There seems to be there was a preference to using the best 3 out of 4. And that was reflected in the proposed decision. So it'd be interesting to see what stakeholder feedback you get on the weighting proposal. So, yeah, I just wanted to bring that to your attention.
Yeah, we saw that also, Paul. Thank you for mentioning it here. But the idea is, I don't know if we address this thing, right? So the philosophy is we want to be able to do this every year after summer assessment is done and publish values for use. And then we can always keep updating and refining a methodology, so it's not once and done. I hope we will not wait for another 18 years to update these values. So we will be constantly looking at these and make refinements if a better counting method is better. And then the idea was, once the CPUC's UCAP was done, if that becomes the way we want to count, we can adapt or adjust this UCAP methodology to align with yours once you have a final implementation proposal.
Yeah. But, you know, I guess that's sort of a plug here for future work. And the CPUC process will be, you know, refining for UCAP, you know, what is the supply cushion, what do they call it? Supply cushion, E4D. What is the calculation to look at the hours that we're going to look to value, you know, capacity? And this is something we'll be, you know, looking for, you know, getting as highly detailed proposals as possible in a future CPUC process. So I'll make my plug for Perry and others to start thinking about this issue and present some good proposals.
Thank you, Paul.
Next in the queue, I'm seeing a hand raised from Kathleen Colbert.
Hey, great, thank you. It's Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. I hope a super softball it's meant to be question and I have a couple, but this one I just wanted to clarify that the slide I'm looking at right now, and then there's an earlier slide, the slide 14, I believe. These are intended, they look a little different, but I think they're intended to be the same calculation with just extra clarity on the second chart. Can you just clarify that for me?
Correct. They should be identical calculations. We're just clarifying that we're pulling in the sum of the UCAP that's in the model, the QC of the resources that we've done the ELCC values for, and then the QC for the TR resources. So they should be the exact same equation.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm glad it was as soft as I'm glad it was the softball that I thought it was. And I think that's really helpful. On the earlier slide, it was clearer to me. One of the other question I had for you was just confirming that it is the generation capacity requirement produced by the loss of load, the LOLE study, but just modified with the QC rules. Was clear on the prior slide, so I just wanted to make sure. That's excellent. My second thing actually came up with the back and forth with Perry, and I thought the CAISO team might appreciate hearing that, at least, you know, from Vistra's perspective as an RA supplier, I think we sit a little differently situated from a stakeholder position, I think, relative to some others. So I wanted to share that feedback with you. And I think, Aditya, I actually laughed out loud when you said the thing about how for ELCC, it evaluates 8760, because that is how I think of it. I understand what Perry was suggesting is identify the LOP hours and then align them, but I think of it as 8760, and that's how you kind of get to the solution. From our perspective, even on let's say a thermal, which is what you're talking about with the UCAP and the supply cushion hours, I agree with Perry in the spirit of aligning the hours makes sense. The other principle that I think we believe in is that certainty, having for resources like a thermal, where you can take actions to mitigate risks and show up even better, right? Be a higher performer in your operating state. I think having I think two things. Having certainty of the hours included in the UCAP better incentivize all actions to be taken to do that in those periods. So forward notice actually helps for that type of asset. And so I think some of your ideas banding back of, if we set the hours, does that help? I think it does to some extent. If we agree, that's what we're targeting, is that behavior, it incents it, that happens, cool. The part where I think I'm a little differently situated from some of my peers is, you know, we think all hours. So back on the concept of aligning to the ELCC, I actually do kind of agree in concept, because if ELCC looks at all hours, I think even from a UCAP perspective, honestly, we think looking at all hours, it increases the sample size, which is a huge concern, right? So you don't want an overly small sample size. You want it to be robust. But I think we also want to incent that higher performance in all hours. I recognize not everyone agrees, but I did just want to share that perspective with you so you would know that there's that view on the stakeholder side.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kathleen.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And I'm not seeing any other questions at this time.
Thank you. With that, I think we can proceed to slide 20. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Kristen.
I saw a hand raised, but it was lowered. You can proceed. Thanks. Oh, we did get a question again from Adeline Lasource.
Sorry, I think I was in the queue, but yeah, maybe I click on the button. Anyway, hi everyone. I think also going back to Perry's question and this definition of the supply quotient. I think we discussed that already, but there is maybe still something that might be clarified in the implementation phase, but just bringing back the point, because so last time what we discussed was, okay, there will be this mismatch compared to a proper EOFRD methodology, because you do not really look if the resource was in demand, as Perry just explained. And what we have not clarified yet is for the UCAP calculation for a specific resource that won't be under the ELCC methodology, would you exclude the resources? I mean, these supply quotient hours, will they be excluded in case the resources was not shown? And I think it's also like trying to avoid double counting resources that are on plan outage, forced outage, and I think that was always pushed back, and we did not clarify this point yet. So thank you.
So the hour determination uses RA shown capacity. So basically we are saying if it is shown, if something goes on forced outage, then you'll have substitution in the current design. So we are looking at the 8 hours, only considering the shown capacity. That's how the supply quotient hours are determined. But the calculation of UCAP will be done for all resources, whether it was shown or not shown.
But it would also only look at the forced outages reported. So if the unit is fully on a planned outage,
then that would not impact. Yeah.
It would not impact the UCAP calculation.
Sorry, say that again?
So if the unit, so we selected the hours based off of what was shown in RA, but then when actually taking into account the forced or the outages for the unit-specific UCAP, if a unit is on planned outage and it's 100% out, it would not get penalized in UCAP because it had no forced outage at that time. We would only be including the forced outages in that UCAP calculation.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Andy.
We also did receive a hand raise from Mary Neal as well.
Yeah, Mary Neal from ARM. Hope this is a quick question. Just back to your slide 22 that shows the supply cushion hours. I was just wondering, why are there so many hours in the mornings in March?
Can we go to slide 22, please?
So you're going to have more hours in the morning in March because that's when, you know, the daily shown supply RA minus all the outages, minus the net load, minus the contingent reserves are the smallest. So there could be a number of drivers driving that. It's likely that the peak hour, or not the peak, sorry, it's led to that the demand at that time compared to the supply is not as cushioned as other hours later in the day, because we are not accounting for the wind and solar contribution in RA and in the net load. So there's a lot of reasons that could be driving that. That I can't say that it's always going to be that way. It could very well be that in 2024 there's no supply cushion hours in early March. It's just going to depend on the system conditions at the time and the shown RA.
It just still looks kind of baffling.
Not
to
a
me,
satisfying
but-
answer.
Yeah, I don't get it. I mean, I kind of get like you're saying that the solar though isn't in there, like because like on the midday period it goes like, you know, supply is good.
Yeah.
So I would assume that's solar though. Is that, am I
Yes,
wrong
the
there,
solar's
or?
there. No, you're not. So if we go one slide above, the daily shown RA value that we have there excludes wind and solar. So if wind and solar was shown, we're not counting that in the equation, but then we're also looking at net load instead of gross load. So if solar is really high, you're going to have a low net load during the middle of the day.
Behind the meter solar.
Behind the meter solar, or even utility solar, you're going to have a lot lower net load for this calculation during the middle of the day. So wind and solar is captured here, but it's not included on the daily shown RA portion, and we're looking at net load rather than gross load or managed load. So it's counted for there, but it's one of those we're not increasing the amount of shown RA in the middle of the day and then subtracting the load, because those are peak hours, right? Like that's when the demand's highest. We just have a lot of solar. So it's accounted for. It's just accounted for as differently.
Okay. Yeah, because I think so that made sense, and then seeing more in the early evening made sense. But then just that morning in March, and then even like comparing March to like June in 2023, June had almost no hours, it looks like. So I was a little baffled by that too. So it just seemed a little bit odd. So if you have any more color that if you could add, I mean, I'd be interested. I don't know about other stakeholders, but.
And Mary, another driver that's impacting this determination is the CEC forecast, which is the basis and the driver for how much capacity we get shown, versus the actual demand that we're using to calculate the supply cushion hours. So for March, for example, the forecast is usually low. Therefore, if LSEs are just showing enough capacity to meet their obligation, we're not going to get a lot of excess capacity shown to us. Versus if we have high demand in those morning hours, then if you compare the actual high demand in those morning hours with the supply that we were shown, and then take out all the impact of outages, and March is a prime time for taking special maintenance outages, then you could see the cushion narrowing in those hours. So like Mark said, there could be a lot of drivers, but understanding the difference between what's driving the RA showings versus what's being used, the forecast that's driving the RA showings versus the actual load that's used for the calculation of the supply cushion hours.
So it could be maintenance-related outages as playing a factor? I think you mentioned that.
It could be.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, that might make sense. Okay, we can move on, but thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mary.
We do have also a hand raised by Lisa Bro.
Hi, Lisa Bro, Microsoft. Just to add a little color to the supply cushion conversation, I'm closely following the CEC hyperload forecasting, and it's actually quite incredible to see that they are forecasting some March peak hours in the morning that will rival the peak hours in the afternoon in March. So I think this is a trend that we need to keep our eyes on. I'm surprised to see it admittedly in 2022 and 2023. I can't say that so all of that is predicated on the electrification that the state is pushing forward in California. So truly by the early 2030s, we start to see some peaks in the March morning hours that are quite impressive. So I throw that out as just something to keep an eye on. And it is a trend we're seeing in the data that the CEC is putting out. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Lisa. It's very good insight.
And I'm not seeing any other hands at this moment.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. I can pass it back to Ansel, and I think we're on slide 25.
Yep. Thanks, Mark. Great discussion. I think we covered many of these advantages and trade-offs that are also highlighted in the paper. I think we could speak to a few of them here briefly. So the advantages that we see in the proposal, you know, it is based on the feedback that we've received to focus on default rules that would provide a single monthly value for each resource. And with that, thus the focus on average ELCC, which can incorporate capacity and energy contributions in that single value. With a resource-specific approach for the resources noted here to provide that performance incentive as opposed to a class average methodology. Otherwise, there's also a line, you know, we've attempted alignment with the CPUC's proposed UCAP design, although we've discussed that that is still in development. So we continue to kind of iterate and try to maintain that alignment going forward. And on the trade-off side, you know, the class average methodologies do not provide the union-specific performance motivation for the ELCC resources. And then the last couple trade-offs are sort of focused on existing challenges that we did hear about, which would not be addressed by an LRA adopting these rules, but they, again, those problems exist today still, including the partial showing issue that was asked about by, I think, by Eric Little earlier. We still think the highest of the two values provided by LRAs for an individual resource is partially shown. And this proposal does not provide information about different hours verifying net versus gross peak sufficiency, although it does achieve that goal for ELCC-based accreditations. So I think, again, we've covered many of these, so unless there are any additional questions, I think this is probably a good time for a short break before we dive into the next element of the proposal.
I'm not seeing any other questions at this time, so we can go ahead and take a short break. And do you want to take a 5-minute break, Ansel?
Yeah, let's do 2:52.
Sounds good. We'll see everyone back at 2:52.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. We're now going to be returning the discussion to discuss accounting for RA resource capabilities during peak conditions.
All right. Thank you, Christina. I think we have one more question in the chat from the last discussion. We can take that right now.
Yes. We received a question in the chat from Scott Olson saying, quote, if this proposal for default QC rules is adopted, does this mean that annually CAISO will produce multiple NQC reports, one that is the default and others that reflect LRA NQCs if different? Specifically, will there be a default NQC report for solar and wind that uses average ELCC and a CPUC NQC report that uses the peak hour exceedance? End quote.
Thanks, Christina. Important distinction. We're not anticipating a sort of direct change to the NQC list process due to the default rules update. If an LRA decides to adopt the methodology as they have the authority to do today, they can request modifications to the NQC list through the development process that occurs in the summer. I think to your question about, so I guess the answer is essentially no. There will be one final NQC list each year, which is the case today.
And stakeholders have input on that.
Yeah.
You know, if you think it's beneficial for us to produce a parallel default-based, you know, NQC list, I guess we don't want to cause confusion because the program will continue to be driven by the LRAs. The QC values will continue to be LRA-based, and everything we talked about here so far are our default QCs. So I guess if stakeholders think, you know, think it's beneficial for us to produce a parallel default-based QC list for reference or advisory or for LRAs to use, then we could look into the feasibility of that. So I guess let us know.
Yeah, that might be more of a QC list, if you will, than an NQC list. So, yeah. All right, let's take one more question, and then we can go to slide 26.
Yes, we have a hand raised from Steve Keen.
Hi, it's Steve Keen from Edison. Discussing that, just I thought that what you were looking at would have a monthly QC list. So instead of an annual one, you'll have to do them monthly. So that's question number one is just, can you tell me if I'm right or wrong in there?
So I think the proposal does not include a requirement to publish such a reference list, but I think the intention is there. But you're correct. If we did produce a list of values based on these methodologies we're proposing, they would be monthly, which is the case for the NQC list as well. It has 12 values for each resource today. So we would want to produce something to match that process.
Okay. The other thing is, given some of the issues that have arisen like this year with the QC or the NQC list, a lot of the entities using the PUC generated exceedance values for various things, but then using a differently determined PRM and compliance mechanism. Are you looking at putting in, I don't know if it would be in the BPM or in the tariff or something, you know, a requirement that the QCs or NQCs that are used be consistent with the PRM that's used?
We have not considered this. I think we highlighted in the paper sort of what that may come down, or another element of that is the different QC values for partially shown resources between two LRA plans.
Yeah.
So these problems may, you know, are not addressed by this proposal. They, but, you know, I think the intention with the default rules being updated is to provide a holistic set of QC methodologies and PRM that, if adopted, would make sense as one proposal or as one methodology. So,
Yeah.
so I think we'd be interested in feedback on that element. So.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, it does kind of concern me when people, and I think to some extent, you know, some of the stuff you put out indicated that that may be happening this year, where people are using different methodologies that don't correspond correctly. I'm not 100% sure how to deal with that, but I do think that may be something we need to at least discuss. But thank you. Yeah, and I did see that discussion you were talking about later on. Is that something or is that in the presentation? Are you going to get to that later?
We don't have anything more on this today. I think this is probably an item for track 3 discussion as well, like Cartha mentioned earlier, but, you know,
Can you describe again, Steve, exactly what you're looking to discuss, or what the...
What I'm asking here is just, you referenced, and I noticed this in the straw proposal, the indication that today the way things are done is, you know, with the QC or the counting mechanism, if a resource shows up on multiple LSEs under different LRAs, it may have a different QC under each of those LRAs, and then you use the highest value for everything. You know, that can potentially cause problems when there are very different counting systems. And I think that's kind of what, you know, what this discussion is kind of getting at. The previous default, you know, previously it was 15%, and then you had the default thing that nobody used, and the PUC would put out numbers, and that's kind of what everybody defaulted to. This last year, the PUC put out those numbers, but they were very different because they were for the, they weren't designed for a peak power mechanism. They were designed for a, you know, for the SOD. So the values can be very different. But yet there were, you know, that's what entities tended to use, what non-CPUC entities tended to use in their discussion, but they didn't have the slice a day mechanism that those were the appropriate values for. So, and I think now we're getting to the point where, you know, there are different mechanisms. The PUC is using slice a day. Other entities may be using different mechanisms. You're going to come up with a default one that may be something else different. But I think as you've emphasized, the way you select the PRM is kind of dependent on how you're doing the resource counting. They're interrelated. So I guess the idea is when you set your default ones, or you know, if you choose the default PRM that you have, do you also have to choose the default counting mechanism?
Yeah, no, Steve, I think you're bringing up a great point, and I think that you're probably highlighting something that's a challenge today, sort of in the current. Like, I don't think that the default rules per se is what is going to leading to some of those differences and potential challenges. I do think there'll be opportunities within the context of the other tracks to bring up areas where either from an implementation standpoint or from like a policy design standpoint, there might be opportunities to look for ways to drive towards greater consistency. Like one of the challenges that we face, I think that you're bringing up, is like obviously we're wanting to have a program that works with different LRAs that have different counting rules and potentially different PRMs set. So while we're allowing them to have these different structures, we're certainly wanting to make sure that our process and procedures are working effectively with these different designs. And sort of one of the challenges is certainly for partial resources, where there might be a resource that's shown in one program with one type of counting rules and another program with another counting rules, and how do we operationalize that within our processes effectively, I think is kind of like one of the key questions that's sort of one question. Another one more generically is, how do we sort of square these different program designs and our backstop processes and our out of substitution rules? I think there's sort of an opportunity in those different forums to bring up this topic and to figure out the details about, like, how do we operationalize this effectively? But I don't think this is really necessarily driven by the default process, but more of just the fact that there are different counting rules within the different LRA designs that we're trying to align in our processes. But yeah, thanks, Steve, for bringing it up. And
I agree.
You agree.
I mean, the other thing, I haven't seen it in today's presentation, and I noticed it in the straw proposal, and I think it's worth making sure people are aware of is the, where you're still looking at setting the default rules having a single monthly value. But then you have this statement, it is worth noting, however, the CAISO has scoped the consideration of an energy sufficiency verification and potentially a second showing verification in the net peak hour for future phase of track 3 in the RAMPD stakeholder process. That I was very encouraged to see that. I think that's something that should definitely be talked about if you're really concerned about reliability. And I don't know if you watched the FERC conference on RA. I found that very interesting, and I think the one thing that I took away from that was that we're in a very different situation in California than just about all the entities back east. They're looking at using marginal ELCC, and I think we've already gone past that here, at least with the PUC with slice a day, because we're at a point where we've discovered that there are problems with marginal ELCC, and the entities back east haven't gotten to that yet. That's still a lot better than what they have, but it's not, they haven't gotten to the level of renewable resources, storage resources that we have, and the issues that we're already starting to see. I think they're running somewhat behind us. So, I would be interested in hearing your thoughts on what came out of that conference and how what we're doing in California fits in with what's been going on back east. That's probably not for this meeting, but maybe for a future meeting.
No, thanks, Steve. I'm glad you listened into it. Thanks for not putting us completely on the spot to opine on what was a very robust discussion over 2 days at FERC on sort of RA changes. I also appreciate your, I think it's probably worth noting that, yeah, those topics are, key to us. Sort of, I think some of the other track reforms, I think you kind of highlighted track 3 and what we've indicated on sort of the scope items on that. I'd say for the sake of this discussion today on default rules, I don't necessarily think we need to go down all those paths, but I agree there's probably a variety of different ways that we can sort of look at sufficiency of energy and capacity over, over the 24 hours, and we kind of mentioned the fact that it could be a peak net peak and energy type check. I think some people have sort of brought the ideas of like it could be something that looks at like as an ELCC type look across multiple periods and tries to square them. We're obviously trying to stay aligned with the different LRA program designs, which is obviously a challenge when there are sort of diverging ways to look at reliability. So all to say is like we look forward to that discussion. We recognize that there aren't necessarily easy answers. We recognize the fact that it's important from a reliability standpoint to have those conversations. And thanks, Steve, for bringing it up. And we can maybe at that time, I'll consider maybe touching a little bit on some of the RA technical conference that And so I really appreciate you bringing up that suggestion too. So thanks again.
I maybe have another thing to add. I think when we give out, like Ansel mentioned, we'll give out the methodology to calculate default counting rules. We'll have a default planning reserve margin, but we may also post a spreadsheet. It's not going to be called the default NQC. We should probably come up with a completely different terminology that doesn't say NQC in that, but that is resource by resource. You have nameplate and 12 months of what that resource is, you could use to account, and then a planning reserve margin that goes for each of those months. That spreadsheet might be posted once a year in October or whatever the time frame that we have to decide. So if LRAs want to use those things, they have both the counting rules that they have to apply and the planning reserve margin against their load by month. So that probably will be done, should be done for this to be useful, because otherwise it's hard to calculate average ELCC if you only have the methodology.
Great. All right. Yes, I think this is showing our the deficiencies with the remote meeting. I think generally our RA stakeholder meetings have been in person, so I think those allow for some of these ranging discussions, but we'll take what we can get. So thank you, Steve. Let's move to slide 26, and we'll jump into the next element of the proposal. So this portion of the proposal is based on, let's go to the next slide, an additional problem statement that we had in the issue paper based on what was developed in the working group process with stakeholders, indicating that the availability of resources based on varying seasonal ambient D rates is not consistently reflected in a resources NQC today, which creates challenges in reliably operating the grid. Let's go to the next slide. So we heard a lot from stakeholders on this topic at the last few meetings as a part of the working group, and we've developed a straw proposal based on that input and those suggestions. So I have, I believe the substance of the overview goes to slide 35, so I'm just going to run through these, and then we can take questions and clarifying questions and feedback after I get through the overview, which will include stakeholder feedback, the proposal itself, as well as some examples for facilitating clarity. So what we heard through the comments and in the workshops, we had several stakeholders indicate some concerns about potential double counting based on, if we were to move forward with taking a look at ambient D rate impacts in the NQC process, this could be seen as double counting if LRAs are already incorporating these outage rates or impacts in their accreditation methodology. An additional comment that was forwarded by several stakeholders along similar lines was basically a recommendation for how to account for ambient D rates in a way that makes sense. And so we had some recommendations to allow or to move forward with an approach based on modifying the NQC process, as well as a method of doing that, which looked at kind of this idea of maximum possible capacity or some kind of performance metric during high load days. We also had a suggestion from CalCCA, I think based on what is done in other markets where scheduling coordinators could submit their own results from a test when there's historic data is not sufficient. So let's go to the next slide. We did discuss the idea of a testing verification program for RA resources. That would be something that's based in our current tariff authority to modify NQC values based on testing. I think we heard from stakeholders that the kind of administrative burden of a testing program would not bring requisite benefits to reliability. And we did float the question of, the relationship between installed capacity and sort of QC value or capacity value and where the must offer obligation might fit in between those numbers. In this proposal, there's no proposed change to the must offer obligation requirements. There were some observations that perhaps in other markets the must offer or equivalent structure is based on solid capacity, which is verified through testing or some similar approach, and then there's a lower value perhaps that is the accredited value. So I think, you know, we felt in the interest of simplicity, we didn't include any changes, like I said, in the proposal, but we're open to those conversations. I think especially as LRAs move forward with more robust accreditation mechanisms that might reduce QC relative to the Pmax value. So keeping that a conversation open. So let's go to the next slide with that and get into the proposal. So what we put forth is, again, other ISOs, as well as the Western Resource Adequacy Program, have testing programs for verifying their resource capabilities during peak load conditions. But again, we heard from stakeholders that it might be easier and more simple to propose an approach for verifying capabilities based on operational data, such as outage rates, instead of a testing program. Again, we didn't propose any changes to the MOO requirements. So essentially, in a nutshell, our proposal is examine recent peak load conditions in recent years, and then based on those conditions and times, review RA resources impacts from ambient derates due to temperature during those times, and then essentially or effectively derate their QC values as necessary based on this analysis. And so what this would look like is we floated the, you know, with stakeholder comments in mind, this idea of a capability value serving as essentially as a cap on an RA resources NQC value. So I think the examples will do a good job of illustrating this method, but let's go to the next slide, which is a similar recap of what I just described in a little bit more detail. These steps are also in the straw proposal paper. So effectively, I would draw your attention to steps 3 through 5, which is sort of how this is implemented in the NQC process. So the assessment in steps 1 and 2 would produce a capability value for a resource. We would compare that value to the resource's QC value, and then take the lower of the two values, and then the remaining NQC process, including deliverability, would flow through from there. So let's go to the next slide to take a look at steps 1 and 2, steps 1 through 3. So essentially, this equation looks in some ways familiar to the supply cushion UCAP equation, but it's looking at sort of a different subset of hours and also different outage rate impacts. So what you're seeing is essentially at a resource-specific basis, creating this capability value, looking at the highest load 20 days over the past 2 years, and excluding the highest 10 of those 20, so essentially taking days 11 through 20, ranked by load. And this is for the purpose of excluding extreme event impacts and attempting to focus on a sort of median peak load conditions. And then based on those days, on a resource-specific basis, looking at the impacts of ambient derates due to temperature during those every hour of those days. So let's go to the next slide. And let's hit these examples, which I think are helpful for the remaining steps in the proposal. So this is an example where a 500 megawatt combined cycle plant, which may have a Pmax of 500 in this example, and may also receive a QC value of 500 from its local regulatory authority. And then through the process in the previous slide, we calculated lower capability value of, in this case, 480. And that would mean under the proposal that the NQC would be 480, and that's assuming the resource has full capacity deliverability status. So this is fairly straightforward, but if we go to the next slide, I wanted to highlight an example of how this lesser of the two approach would look with a UCAP methodology coming from a local regulatory authority. So in this case, same resource in the example, but it's subject to a QC value of 460 megawatts based on the local regulatory authority's UCAP accreditation method. But we would produce the same value for the capability value for this resource, 480 in this case. And that would mean comparing those two values, we would be taking the lower of the two, which would be the QC value. So that would remain, effectively what this would mean would be if an LRA, say the CPUC who's proposing UCAP today, had this in place, then this process that we're proposing would have no impact on the NQC value. And this is essentially keeping in mind the fact that if an LRA is already looking at ambient D-rate due to temperature impacts, this would mean that this step is not necessary that we're proposing. So I'll have one more slide with advantages and trade-offs. Again, this proposal is based on what we heard from stakeholders and a way to kind of account for resource capabilities in NQC value. So let's go to the next slide. So the advantages we've identified are, it's a fairly straightforward equivalent forced outage rate calculation method, and through the lesser of the two approach defers to LRA accreditation methodologies if they're accounting for these impacts already. It would be performed on a resource specific level, and it could be based on OMS data. I think the major trade-offs we see are, this could be subject to essentially inconsistent reporting of outages in the sense that, we're using here ambient D-rates due to temperature effectively as a proxy for resource capabilities. There is a possibility that if a resource is on a forced outage that takes, for plant trouble, for example, that takes 100% of its capacity on outage, the scheduling coordinator may not report concurrent impact from an ambient D-rate due to temperature outage because the plant is already on a plant trouble outage and it takes it offline. So that would essentially, in the calculation we're proposing, you would not have an impact in that calculation if there were no ambient D-rate due to temperature outage reported. And then an additional trade-off is, the proposal does not include a seasonal or monthly adjustment. This is just a calculation for an annual value that could be compared to the QC value. So I think in general, before I wrap up, this is all the content, before we hear from stakeholders, I think, recognizing this is based on input that we've had from the working group process and understanding that we are open to suggestions and feedback. This is a proposal that could meet the problem statements that we identified, but we're hoping to hear from stakeholders as to their thoughts on this proposal. So.
Maybe one thing of note, I think it's particularly as well, I think we recognize the fact that, great, I see Paul Nelson from the CPUC has his hand raised. We recognize that the CPUC also has as a part of their UCAP design is looking to address ambient outages due to ambient D-rates within that design. So there's kind of some question about how would this work alongside it? Was this really necessary to the degree that the PUC ultimately adopted that proposal? So I think we were more wanting to, based on the stakeholder feedback, have this as an option to discuss, but certainly looking for feedback on kind of the advantages and trade-offs in particular. So yeah, appreciate it. Should we go to Paul?
Let's do it.
First in the queue, we have Paul Nelson.
Hi, this is Paul with the CPUC Energy Division. I think this is following up, on a question that Eric Little brought up, where you have a resource that's being used by that's being used by resources, a resource is being used by two LRAs, and they adopt different values. And I think you said you were going to use the higher of that. Is that right?
That is the current policy, yes.
Okay. So if I looked at the page 34, that diagram, we go to slide 34, the example 2.
Yeah.
So you in this example, you had the LRA value of 460 and another LRA had a value of 470. You would use the 470 for the June NQC.
That is right.
All right.
Yes, good question, Paul. There could be sort of a, that is how that would impact this mechanism. So.
That was my only question.
I take it, Paul, your question is also, I think, probably a little beyond this proposal. I think, are you also basically trying to understand sort of the implementation impact of the PUC adopting the UCAP design?
Yeah.
Is that where?
Yeah. And then how that interacts, because there may be some resources that are, shared between CPUC jurisdictional and non-CPUC jurisdictional resources. So.
Yeah, your more broad question, I think, is a fair one. We've had a number of discussions internally about our current processes and how they might need to evolve in the future. And so I don't think any of those are necessarily set in stone either. There's various implementation and market trade-offs between these different options. So yeah, I wouldn't necessarily look at that as a hard constraint that can't be discussed in the future, as much as it is our current practice in terms of how we address multiple LRAs with different values.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Paul, think about it, it's the same process as today when it comes to multiple LRAs, different values. We use the higher of the two. What this proposal is saying, that the capability value that is calculated based on this methodology for ambient D-rates will set the maximum allowable QC from any LRA. That's kind of the cap. So in this example, even though Pmax 500, 480 is the maximum this resource QC this resource can receive from all the LRAs. And then after that, the deliverability cuts would happen. So if you think of a process, the first half of today's discussion was all about the default QC rules. So these are only engaged if the LRAs do not adopt their own. So in this case, PUC, you have your own QC values. They would come in first to establish the draft NQC list. Step 2 today is we apply deliverability cuts and checks at Pmax and all that. We would add another step here that happens before the deliverability cuts happen in the NQC process, where we cap your QC value at the capability value, which is based on ambient D-rates. So QC value from the LRAs, step 1, step 2, capability value capping, step 3, NQC cut, or deliverability cut, and then finally you end up with the NQC value.
Okay, thank you for those clarifications.
Yeah. I would just add, there have been a lot of questions about this element of the highest of the two being the value that results in our system between multiple QC values between different LRAs. So I think even though there's not a proposal, there's nothing in the proposal related to this, we would welcome comments on that kind of element of our current policy. So.
Next in the queue, we have Eric Little.
Hey, Eric Little from CalCCA. Just a couple of questions for you. The first one is on this issue of ambient D-rates. Can you talk a little bit about what would prevent somebody from claiming that it's some other outage card to avoid a D-rate? Because I mean, it seems to me that what I've been told is working in a power plant is a lot like having a car. You can always identify something on it that needs to be fixed. And so I'm not sure that you can really take something and say, well, that was an ambient derate. It wasn't really a plant trouble. So I'm wondering, is there something else that balances that to make sure that people aren't going to do that?
Do you want to?
Sure, yeah. I guess, Eric, this applies today as well. That's a good question, and applies today as well. The tariff requires the scheduling coordinators that are acting on behalf of the generator to accurately report their outages. We rely on their accurate and, compliance with our tariff. Because we don't know what's going on with the generator. What we know, with the information we know about what's going on with the resource itself or the generator is based on the outages that are reported to us by the SC. So we rely on their accurate and honest reporting. I think in this case, as Ansel said, we could see examples of, if the resource, it's pretty straightforward. If the resource is fully operational, and in a given hour, in a summer day, the resource is not capable of operating TP max because of the temperature. And it would report that as a derate, a partial derate, an outage card. That's pretty straightforward. The generator should know exactly what's going on. But where it could be an issue is if at that same day, the resource is fully out, already out before we got into the operating day. It was out for maintenance or another forced outage and the resource tripped, and it's fully out of service. So in this case, even if the generator is reporting an overlapping ambient due to temp outage, there would be no more derate to report because the resource was already fully derated in the plant maintenance or plant trouble outage card. And in that scenario, this methodology would not capture those derates accurately. And I think that's the challenge that, at least one challenge we identified. Perhaps another challenge that we looked at is redundancy, knowing that the PUC and perhaps some other LRAs, or the PUC mainly, is, planning to account for ambient derates in their QC methodology. So a question that, Ansel asked at the beginning is this still, do stakeholders think this is still effective? And with knowing that that's planned for the PUC proceedings.
Yeah, I just think the PUC is going to need help on defining that, and if we're helping to define it here, that's fine. I just want to consider all of the alternatives. I guess the other thing that we've been thinking of, and haven't vetted this through thoroughly yet, but if you're looking for X number of days of ambient derate to be able to prove out your numbers, have you considered using X number of days in which the resource has not declared another type of outage? So if you're looking for 20 days worth and they've got 5 days worth of another outage listed in there, you pull an additional 5 days to get your 20.
That is could be one way to deal with the overlapping outages problem, is to just exclude the days with a different outage nature of work. So thanks for the feedback, Eric.
Okay, I appreciate it, and we'll put it in comments for further consideration. And then the second question that I had is, I know that for ancillary services, particularly for REG, we have testing requirements. There are methodologies, and I don't think I've heard anybody say that that's overly burdensome. This is resource adequacy. It is a pretty big value. It is a pretty big cost for customers. I'm concerned that we're writing off the idea of somebody doing a test because of a perception that it's too difficult and too administratively burdensome. In a tight RA market, I'm not convinced that we want to be giving up megawatts simply because we're not willing to do some form of a test. So I think we should reconsider that. Thank you.
Thanks for your comments, Eric. Yep.
Next in the queue, we have a hand raised by Kathleen Colbert.
Great, thank you. Kathleen Colbert from Vistra.
Yeah, no, thanks so much for this. So I think, you know, our feedback, kind of our questions are circling around this same bigger question. Wanted to share a couple things, and I also really want to support what Eric just said. My biggest note that I'm struggling with on this has to do with this idea of how I understand your proposal is a single ambient derate, or maybe I'm going to call it ambient cut because we have deliverability cuts, so I'm just going to do that to keep it easy. An ambient cut, it's single value for all months within the year. And is that right? Okay, cool.
That's correct.
Yeah, I think that is really problematic, especially under our monthly design. And the reason I think it's problematic is because what Eric just said, you know, leaving megawatts on the table, while that ambient impact is accurate, potentially accurate for, let's say, a September month, its availability to provide RA supply in a month like, let's say, January or February is going to be totally different. So in a time period when those ambient impacts don't exist, you're just taking it away from the RA market. And I do agree that in a time when it's tight and we're focused on affordability, it just doesn't seem like it's in the best interest of the market to do that. So piece of feedback, maybe that's something you guys could take back, think about, and see if you move forward with this proposal, at least some way that you can, you know, balance it better so that you're not applying an ambient impact to a month where it wouldn't be relevant. I'd appreciate that.
Thank you, Kathleen. Yep. Noting your comment, I think, did you have another comment there?
I do, but if you would like to respond to that one, I will hold my second one. That'd be great.
Yeah, I think the only other, you know, I would just add, if you peruse the NQC list, as I think some of us in this call may be known to do, you may notice some resources that have, in certain months, they have lower NQC values. And this is something that scheduling coordinators, as you may know, are able to do. They can reduce their NQC values accordingly based on capabilities. So the way we see it is, you know, resource owners can already apply these sort of capability reductions to represent their true capabilities, or some extent try to capture that reduced capacity in warmer months, depending on ambient conditions. So I think just throwing that observation out there and yeah, noting your suggestion. So
yeah. No, but Kathleen, I appreciate that fair feedback. I think what you're getting at is that, like, this might be, such a methodology might be appropriate in August, but that value should be different in January based on the condition. And like, to really, there's a material impact on that. And like in the implementation, it might be worth sort of considering those trade-offs in our implementation plan. So yeah, we can take that feedback.
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, that would be great. I appreciate you thinking about that. And I know this is a straw proposal phase, so I definitely appreciate us continuing to like think about the impacts and how that may or may not work. The second piece I wanted to talk about is, so I do see a difference between the deliverability cuts that we have in our tariff we do today versus this proposal, and I wanted to try to tease out the difference. So like the deliverability assessment and any cuts that come from that, it's an important thing that we do for reliability, but what makes it different to me is that deliverability check isn't always necessarily, it's not explicitly a part of the qualifying capacity methodology with I'll say, with some exceptions or caveats to that statement. Theoretically, the QC should be limiting to your full capacity status, but the deliverability assessment, right, continues to assess whether or not that deliverability is retained over time. So it's kind of an you know, I think of it as just like QA/QC, and important. Whereas this, the way I'm receiving this draft proposal is that it's actually duplicative and like competing with
an LRA that has a QC that includes an ambient impact. I do think that's potentially troublesome in light of our other policies in our tariff that say the LRA can establish the QC, and we only use a default or override that method if they don't establish one and then it has a default approach. I think your proposal here probably does make sense to consider in light of your default QC proposals to see if there's a way to sleeve it in. But if an LRA establishes a QC and it has an ambient, what's troublesome is, let's say in your previous example, the LRA's QC estimates a 10 megawatt ambient impact, and then you're estimating a 20 megawatt ambient impact. We're getting into who's right, and it could get pretty fraught because you're talking about using a criteria for which hours you would even sample to get to that value. And I am really just concerned about that and being able to resolve those conflicts. And I do see it as different if the LRA has ambience in their QC. So that's just another piece of feedback. And I think we should struggle with this harder, but maybe this proposal dovetails more to the default QCs. And then we could talk more about the testing, because I think that there is still merit in keeping the testing option on the table.
Thanks, Kathleen. This is Partha. Just to sort of weigh in there, we kind of recognize that there's like a little bit of a delicate balance that we're doing in this proposal. And certainly, we're looking for feedback on sort of the relative trade-off. I mean, part of it was sort of more aligned with the idea of like, originally when it came out of the working group process, it was probably more of like identifying that problem statement around during some of those really hot days, the fact that we saw fairly large ambient D rates from resources and maybe significant differences between sort of the more extreme days versus even sort of the seasonal. And so part of what sort of fell out of that was that, hey, when we looked at other processes, it seemed like there was sort of something that was analogous to almost answer service testing, where there could be some sort of testing and verification process within our tariff to say, hey, can it actually perform to this level? Some people have brought up on a seasonal basis. There might be sort of merit to that. We kind of recognize as well the fact that it's just probably more of like, is there a role for the ISO to perform some sort of minimum verification process on what the capability looks like for these resources during during some sort of period in which we are testing for. And that's probably we're trying to see like, what is that right balance? We're certainly not wanting it to be something that looks like, hey, we're doing a UCAP type haircut on the side, but more of a, this is something that's analogous to testing, analogous to verifying the fact that the resource can produce at some level. But, certainly we're open to feedback if the other LRAs have it covered, if it's probably more effective in the default processes. Love to hear from other folks on if those methods would be more effective. But yeah, thanks.
Can I make a follow-up suggestion? Because I appreciate the spirit of what you're putting forward, so I want to be helpful. I do think there's a role for you to play. I would love to see you propose, work with energy, let's say focus on the CPUC, because that's an LRA that we know is pursuing ambient in their QCs, right? So in that world, I would love to see you work with Energy Division and submit comments in the RA docket with a proposal of how you could take this idea and coordinate and, provide kind of, again, like a sanity test. Because that's how your proposal is reading to me. CPUC is going to come up with their ambience, and there are ambient, there are, forced outages that are flagged as ambience. Let's do a little sanity testing. That has merit, Partha and the whole CAISO team, that has merit. And I think it's an interesting idea. I just would like to see you move it into the QC conversation for LRAs that are moving towards an ambient. And if you can submit that proposal after kind of figuring out what a good way to do that might be, then you can get this idea into the QC, and when we have our QC set up, it'll factor in. I mean, that would be my preference. And so just throwing it out there for you guys to think on. Thank you.
Super helpful, Kevin.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
Next in the queue, we have a hand raised by Mary Neal.
Hi, Mary Neal again from ARM. So I understand. So you're saying this for this annual value. So this is an ambient D rate that would apply to all months of the year?
If triggered in the, but based on the QC examples we shared, yes.
So like it wouldn't vary, even for a plant in the desert, it would be the same reduction in January and in July?
No, it will be unique to each month, right?
The proposal is looking at the whole year and applying it across the NQC value as a comparison. Yeah, so yes.
But would you agree that that's strange? I mean, in the winter, it's going to be freezing cold, right? It's not, these are for hot weather, right?
There may be sort of a loss of the granularity, yeah.
Yeah, no, this is the feedback is anticipated, and I think that like when we look at the implementation, implementation of this, it might make more sense to move to a seasonal or some other construct. If we look at the other markets and how they do it, they'll have different testing and the different seasons that have very different values. And so there is some trade-off to having sort of a more of a process that would have multiple verifications in different seasons. So, but to the degree that we're going down this path and the stakeholders are indicating it, we'd love to hear that feedback. Sort of, would it make more sense to have some other granularity? So, yeah, appreciate that, Mary.
And then to follow up on the previous conversation, could CAISO provide some more feedback as to why it chose to put the UCAP as just up to the default counting, but then for this ambient D rate, put it on the NQC? Why the disparate treatment in the proposal?
I think, yeah, if I understand your question, essentially the understanding is the proposal is to take the higher of the two between a QC value and the capability value is a sense that if the QC methodology incorporates ambient D rates, it would end up reducing the QC value of a resource accordingly. And that would mean that it would end up below whatever capability value we calculate here, but that may not necessarily be the case depending on the resource or the methodology. So I think that is the approach with sort of the verification approach. And so you mentioned the default rules. If an LRA adopts those, it would be subject to the same comparison.
We just received a hand from Eric Little.
Yeah, thank you, Eric Little, Cal CCA. Can I suggest that maybe there's some data that can be pulled here by the ISO to tell us where the problem really lies? Is it possible for the ISO to pull the number of ambient D rates by month and provide those? Because I'm with others. I think the ambient D rate problem is a summer problem, not a winter problem. And maybe this is as easy as splitting it in 2 seasons, but it seems like you guys have data that would be able to show when is ambient D rate actually a problem for the grid and when is it not?
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, we'll take that back to the team. We've shown data similar to that in the February workshop, but we can take that back as well.
Thank you.
And I'm not seeing any other hands raised at this moment.
Thanks. Yeah, I think just on the topic of the monthly versus seasonal versus annual, we would welcome sort of suggested approaches to modify. I think there are a lot of nuances and questions that are raised when sort of zooming in beyond annual, and obviously there are just sort of design choices, which months are the seasons, et cetera, but I do think, yeah, we would be open to those suggestions.
We did just receive a hand from Paul Nelson.
Yeah, this is Paul Nelson with the Energy Division. To follow with Eric Little, it's not just seasonal, but geographic. A combined cycle unit located in Blythe may have a D rate that would occur in March, but yet a combined cycle unit located in the Northern California coast potentially may have no D rate due to, or very little D rate due to temperature. So there's also a geographic element on temperature D rates.
Thanks, Paul.
It seems like at least in terms of this feedback, the feedback has been super helpful, and it might be like this within the comments. We'll think about how to structure the comment template later, but it's kind of like we have one almost threshold issue, which is kind of like, should we be moving forward with a process that looks to D-rate based on ambient, and then like
as a proxy for testing, kind of.
Yeah, as a proxy for testing, some sort of verification process. And this, should we do anything? Maybe there's like another branch of testing versus verification. Sure. And then there's kind of a third question of like, if we're going down the path of doing one of these, how are we looking at seasonal, monthly, and geographic, and defining those more granularly and providing data to justify it. So it seems like we kind of need answers to all three from stakeholders on kind of like the trade-offs of having this within our tariff and the merits of it, particularly given where the PUC is going and where other LRs are going with our program design. And then when if to the degree that the answer is yes in some respect, then I think we can sort of move forward on sort of some of those more granular questions around defining seasons, defining geographic locations that correspond with those seasons appropriately. But yeah, it's super helpful feedback. So yeah, thanks.
Christina, it looks like we might have a few chat questions, and then we're getting close to time here, so we can make a decision on wrapping up here.
Yeah, so we've received a question in the chat from Peter Griffiths. This might be a little bit repetitive to some of the other questions. He said, does this proposal apply the ambient D rate for all months of the year when the D rate only happens in the summer months?
That's right. Yeah, I think we've addressed that.
Yeah. And then we were getting a question from Rick Benitez in the chat. He hasn't asked his question yet. Rick, if you go ahead and raise your hand, I can unmute you, or if you write your question in the chat, we can read it aloud. But other than that, I'm not seeing any other questions coming in at this moment.
All right. Let's go to the next slide. Okay. Christina, I think we can hand it to you here. I just, on behalf of the ISO team, thank you for your feedback and questions today. This has been very helpful. And hopefully this was helpful as well to stakeholders as we walk through the proposal. Christina, you can take it away for our next steps here.
Thanks, Ansel. So for next steps, the team is welcoming stakeholder feedback on this proposal, and comments are due June 25th. A final draft of the final proposal will be issued for review and input. And if you have any questions at any time, feel free to reach out to us at isostakeholderaffairs@CAISO.com. Next slide, please. Now I just have a few announcements before we wrap up today. Here you can see some of the meetings taking place at the ISO this week. Next slide, please. And here you can see business practice manual updates. Next slide, please. And lastly, for insights into the ISO grid and market operations, please be on the lookout for our Energy Matters blog, or you can always subscribe. Here you can see some of the latest blog posts. The latest one we have is regarding strengthening reliability through year-round gas-electric coordination. So with that, we'd like to thank you so much for joining today's discussion. As a reminder, this meeting was recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. All meeting materials are available online and the video file will be posted soon. We thank you very much and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
This event has concluded. Thank you for using event services. You may now disconnect.